All right, folks, here we go. Continuing with the notes for Chapter 9. When we ended the last video, we were talking a little bit about the types of syndication that are available to local television stations. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about how networks work with local TV stations. And basically what happens here is that you've got this arrangement in which a network is pretty much upheld and bolstered by the local television stations that carry its programs. And these local stations are called affiliates. There's roughly 200 stations that are affiliates of each of the big four networks that are out there. We're talking about ABC, CBS, and NBC. They used to be called the big three. And then with Fox coming along, now it's considered the big four. And between them, they cover pretty much the entire U.S. population with TV. Not so vast in coverage are the newer networks, the netlets, if you will. They're at a comparative disadvantage. They've got about 100 affiliated stations across the country, so they don't cover as many people. It's somewhere in the neighborhood of 85 to 90% of U.S. television households. And actually what the netlets do is in certain markets where they don't have an affiliate, they will go to a local cable operator in that area and have coverage of their content provided in that manner. To become an affiliate, the local TV station signs a contract with the network, and this is known as an affiliation agreement. So historically what has happened within the course of this affiliation agreement is that the major networks agree to pay the local station a fee for broadcasting network programs, and this fee is known as network compensation. The amount a station gets for network compensation can vary wildly, anywhere from $500 an hour to $10,000 per hour. And this depends on several factors: the station's coverage area, its market size, the popularity of the station. All those sort of things come into play. Over the past few years, however, network affiliates have seen their payments from retransmission consent from cable operators rise. So cable operators pay these retransmission fees to the local broadcast stations so that they can carry the local channels on the cable networks. It's a relatively new source of income for broadcast TV stations compared to other ways that they've made money historically. So because of that, and because of the increasing costs of producing programming content, networks have been asking affiliates to shoulder more of the costs for programming. So today, compensation occurs when networks provide affiliates with more time within network programs for local sales. Local affiliates can charge higher cost per thousand rates in primetime programs because the audience is fairly large. In other words, the networks are giving more advertising avail time to the local affiliates that the local affiliates can sell to local advertisers, and the local television stations can make more money by selling that airtime than what they might get with network compensation. So between that and the retransmission fees that they get from cable, the local affiliates have been asked by the networks to, once again, not receive as much compensation, take on more of the costs associated with the network programming. Affiliates may elect to carry the network shows, or they may refuse to put them on the air. Programs that are carried by the station are said to have cleared. Those that are refused are known as preemptions. So the network doesn't really control, by and large, what shows that a affiliate will air or air not. It is at the discretion of the affiliate. Although generally in the agreement that is signed, the local station will agree to air a certain percentage of network programming in order to get the right to be able to sign the agreement. So in return for their investment in programming and their affiliation agreements, the networks gain access to the mass audience throughout the country. Through their system of local affiliates, the networks have the potential to pull together a huge simultaneous audience. And from there, they can sell advertising to national advertisers for a large price, because they can say that they have X number of affiliates that air a program in these particular markets, and we have this many people watching this particular program, so we are asking for this amount of money for you to be able to advertise on this show with our network. All right, let's talk now about a couple of things that have happened in history that aren't really with us anymore, but they still have certain impacts on what happens in broadcasting today. In the early 1970s, the FCC adopted a set of regulations known as the Financial Interest and Syndication Rules, what was known in the industry as FinCEN for short. So FinCEN was the rules that limited network participation in the ownership of programs produced for them and in subsequent syndication. In other words, networks were not allowed to own any of the programs that it put out and could not reap benefits from syndicating those programs later on because they weren't theirs. Those rules were abandoned by the FCC in 1995, so very soon afterward, what happened was that television networks got into the syndication business and they started owning their own shows. So this became a much more lucrative way for program networks to be able to get more revenue for the content that they were producing. Number one, there was economies of scale in that the networks did not have to shop around and buy from another company. The networks also were able to distribute programming in syndication and through other means like DVD sales, and it became a new revenue stream for them in that way as well. Another rule that impacted things in the past, isn't around today, but still has implications, is the Primetime Access Rule. The FCC implemented the Primetime Access Rule in 1971, PTAR for short. The rule restricted the amount of time an affiliate could accept from the network, in effect allowing networks to control no more than 3 hours of the 4-hour primetime nightly schedule. And there were some exceptions to this, but by and large, what the rule said was during the primetime hours, which back then was 7 p.m. to 11 p.m., networks can only show programming in 3 of those 4 hours. So as a result, what most networks decided to do was to maintain the hours of 8 p.m. to 11 p.m., because that's where the older audiences were, and then give the 7 p.m. hour back to local affiliates. So the 7 p.m. hour started being called early fringe. And so early fringe, or what we know of today as local access time, became this 1-hour segment for local affiliated stations that they had to fill with content on their own. Now, if you were a television station owner in one of the top 50 markets, you were not allowed to fill that time with syndicated programming. You had to come up with local content. For the rest of the stations around the country, the FCC wanted you to fill time with local content, but it was basically up to the stations to determine what they were going to do. So a lot of those stations that weren't subject to that you must air local content rule actually wound up picking up syndicated programming. So Game shows like Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy, they wound up benefiting largely. Other types of shows like Entertainment Tonight and other syndicated fare that was not on network television previously started getting all sorts of agreements and orders to air their programming in that 7 o'clock hour. And it wound up being a financially positive thing for most local television stations. PTAR had another lasting effect in that at the time there were many more independent television stations without network affiliations than there are now. And those local independent stations were able to benefit from airing syndicated programming in that 7 p.m. hour and try to compete with the other local stations in the market, which were also airing local programming because they weren't getting content from the networks. And it gave those independent stations a chance to be able to compete a little stronger in their markets. PTAR requirements were abandoned by the FCC in 1996, but its effects on the TV landscape remain, the largest of which is that the networks still maintain a 3-hour primetime schedule from 8 p.m. to 11 p.m. Of course, the exception being Sundays, where primetime is still from 7 till 11 in the evening. Network programming is organized around 2 seasons. The fall premiere season begins in late September and runs through the middle of December, and this is when new programs generally are launched, and returning programs begin showing new episodes. The so-called second season runs from the end of January through the beginning of May. This is when the networks replace low-rated programs with specials and with new series. Now, we should note at this point that the season has been broken up in this way because once upon a time they were actually formally 2 different seasons, the fall season and the spring season. But these days we consider the year to be one season that's kind of broken up into 2 parts. Although even talking about things in that fashion is getting kind of outdated, because these days there seems a lot more variability in the way that shows are premiered on the air. Fox was one of the first networks to play around with this. They would stagger the introduction of their new programming instead of playing along with the big 3 that would generally have what they call a premiere week, which would usually be around the week that the first day of fall on the calendar was, where all the new programs would start showcasing themselves. Fox decided to pretty much air premieres of programming whenever they wanted to. So they were able to use that as a programming strategy against the big 3 networks. Now, who makes the programming? Well, there's the major studios, those that produce series for their own networks, for competitors, and for syndicated distribution. So we talked about that earlier. The networks now big players in producing programs. And a lot of times they'll produce their own programs for their own networks, but they will make them available to competitors and to local stations for syndication as well. You also have independent producers. Some independents are still influential in television series distribution. However, the independent television market is now a relatively small community because of the fact of major studios now having this power to produce their own content, and basically as a result, they by and large have control of the major primetime television shows. As far as pitching a program goes, if you're one of these independents, well, there's 2 different primary means. Some are commissioned by the network whose research and development discovers public interest in a particular program concept. So an executive at the network will say, hey, we want a program that has this sort of plot to it, or these kind of characters to it, this sort of idea. Let's start working on a show. More commonly, though, new program ideas are introduced or pitched to the networks by the producers of those programs. The pitch may be a briefly written synopsis of the program, which would be a short description of the idea meant to engage the interest of the evaluator. Or it might be a concept, a short story narrative, also known as a story or a treatment. It could also be a fully developed sample script. So all of these are different ways that a show can be pitched to a potential network. Most commonly, the program is developed under the terms of what's called a step deal. This is an arrangement by which the program is put together in a series of distinct phases spelled out step by step in a contract. First couple of steps listed on your screen here. First, you want to get a producer to develop the program. And then you have a network or a studio accepting the project for development. And thus begins the process of turning an idea into an actual program. Each party needs to agree to the terms of the arrangement in the step deal, and this is often done through a set of deal memos. The network may get right of first refusal, the contractual right to prohibit the production company from producing the program for another client. So when a step deal is made and the deal memo spells out the terms of the step deal, basically you're entering into this agreement where there's going to be exclusivity between the network and the program producer to work together and not to step outside of that agreement. Now, just because the network has ordered a sample episode, it does not guarantee that the show will find a place in a network's schedule. Usually, the network will show the pilot to test audiences and program executives for their reactions. And then afterwards, there might be some changes that are made to the storyline or changes to characters, character interaction. Any sort of changes that are necessary might be made. They give it another go. Or they may just take the show and throw it out. It's done. By early spring, about a dozen of the pilots that are ordered, and there may be anywhere up to around 100 or so of these different shows that are ordered, but maybe a dozen or so will actually wind up as series orders. Costs of producing network programs. While the concept of a show, its location, and its stars are certainly important, for TV executives, perhaps the most important is its cost. How much is it going to cost to put this show on the air? And, of course, what do we think we can get for advertising revenue as a result of airing this show? In other words, is it going to be worth the investment? Will we make a profit off of the program? The most expensive program type would be the lavish multi-part network miniseries. These can cost anywhere from $7 to $12 million per hour to produce. The most popular program type is also one of the least costly. Situation comedies actually fall into more of the budget category for program content. If a sitcom becomes a true hit and lasts several seasons, its costs can increase dramatically, mostly in the area of star salaries. So as a show gets more and more popular, a cast finds itself more and more valuable and wants to be shown that value in monetary compensation. But the situation comedy is not the cheapest show that can be produced. The bargain basement of network TV, so-called reality shows. And this covers the gamut of things like game shows, news documentaries, infotainment series, various competition types of shows. All of those tend to be relatively cheap to produce because you only have one, maybe two people that are considered talent that are paid, while everyone else is more of a participant in the show as a contestant or an interviewee or something like that. So the costs are down dramatically. Now, as far as cable network programming goes, the economies of cable and broadcast production, well, they're fairly similar, except that costs per episode are usually lower for an equivalent cable series in terms of when the cable station produces the content for itself. Now, theatrical motion pictures, the bulk of the program schedule on the major pay cable services, that's your premium services like HBO, Cinemax, Showtime, they consist of theatrical motion pictures. Most of these are licensed to the pay services by the major Hollywood studios. Some distributors make their films available to multiple pay services at the same time. However, there has been a trend towards studios signing exclusivity deals with pay services, and such contracts guarantee first cable release to one pay service. So it would be an HBO exclusive, for example, in an attempt for HBO to be able to promote that they have this particular movie first, and you need to subscribe to them in order to view that movie. Advertiser-supported cable networks have also benefited through these exclusivity deals where they will get series of movies from various motion picture production houses. And this is how some of the cable networks have really been able to survive, such as Turner Classic Movies and American Movie Classics. TNT also benefiting a lot from signing deals with motion picture production houses. Cable original movies. The typical made-for-cable movie today has a budget somewhere around $4 to $8 million. For the extra cost, the cable made-fors can be typically attractive to better-known casts and high production values, and take on a more delicate or controversial subject matter than is the norm for a made-for-TV movie. The cable networks are generally willing to take risks in terms of various types of content because they know their audiences, and certain audiences will actually seek out that kind of material. Plus, there's the fact that cable isn't quite as heavily regulated in terms of its content as is broadcast networks being able to show various types of things because of decency rules with the FCC. More TV programming is produced today for cable networks than for the traditional broadcast networks, as cable continues to grow in its popularity, and as a whole, cable has surpassed ratings for broadcast TV networks as a whole, plus the fact that cable does tend to cater more to certain audiences with its certain channels. There's kind of that built-in assurance that there may be a particular audience for a particular type of programming content when it's released to a cable channel that fits that particular subject matter, that fits the particular demographic that both the cable network and the programming is looking for. Generally, cable services produce their original programs at lower cost than do the commercial TV networks. Smaller independent production companies are often used instead of the costly major studios, and many series are shot on location or in major cities outside the United States where the dollar is stronger than the local currency is. So you don't just have a lot of shows that are just looking to leave Los Angeles because of the high cost of producing content in LA. That you have shows being produced all over the United States, but it's happening all over the country as well. Canada and the UK have been real hotbeds of activity for programming to be made available for consumption here in the US. Cable networks often engage in co-production ventures with foreign networks and production companies, many of which have had trouble getting their programs into the lucrative American market. So in this way, where you have Perhaps a good example would be when Discovery Channel had co-opted with the BBC to produce some of its documentary series. Those collaborations made it so that content was available to both the BBC and to Discovery, and they share the cost of producing the program. They both get access to the program for their respective markets, and they both benefit from that content. All right, let's take a look now at public television programming. Generally, public TV strives for high-quality programming that is often unavailable on either broadcast or advertiser-supported cable channels. Public TV actually tries to find what they consider to be underserved audiences and develop specific programs for them. So a lot of times, the stuff that may be of interest to certain segments of the population that most of your traditional broadcast networks and even cable networks aren't going to touch because they don't find it economically viable. Public TV will step in and try to serve those audiences. You notice on public TV there's a lot more documentary type of content. There's content that covers various types of subject matter, such as remote populations or certain cultural interests like opera and theater and other types of artistic sorts of programming that a lot of the other networks just do not touch. You'll find them on PBS stations. PBS charges membership dues to its affiliates, and in return, PBS provides programs funded by pooled station funds, by the CPB, by foundations, by individual contributions, and from other sources. So PBS is not a traditional network where the network pays the affiliates. The affiliates actually pay PBS. PBS itself doesn't produce any programs. Instead, it offers something called the National Program Service, the NPS. This serves as a conduit to program producers, usually avoiding the suppliers common to network scheduling. So these various producers will make their programs available through this service, and then the PBS stations can get their programming content from that service. A key difference between the commercial networks and PBS is that the stations decide when to carry national programs. It's not up to the network. Generally, the network, as part of its affiliation agreement, will try to get the affiliates to air its programming at the same day and time that it airs throughout the rest of the network. And sometimes that'll even be written into the affiliation agreement. But in the case of PBS, they do have what PBS considers to be its core schedule, and the programs it makes available on a certain evening. They hope that the PBS stations will carry those programs on that same night. However, PBS cannot require stations to air these shows on the same night that they are fed by satellite to their member stations. Same night carriage does help PBS to promote its shows nationally, but it is completely up to each individual station in each market what programs they are going to air and when they're going to air them to meet the needs of their local audience. Public programming content. Well, the bulk of PBS programming consists of news and public affairs types of content. Next most common would be cultural types of shows. This would be like your masterpiece theater and great performances, shows like that. Children's programming makes up about 1 in 10 of PBS shows, about 10% of the programming lineup. Another 10% would be how-to shows, special interest programs fitting into that category as well. Filling out the PBS schedule are shows that are strictly educational, And there's also a very small sprinkling of sports. You don't see sports a whole lot on PBS, but there are some stations in some markets that may carry a less popular type of sporting content, perhaps like a cricket game or lacrosse or something like that, especially if there's a certain demand for it in a local area. Because part of PBS funding emanates out of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a government-funded entity, PBS has always had to walk a line that avoids taking a partisan viewpoint, something commercial networks are free to do. There's been a lot of talk and a lot of backlash thrown towards PBS because many people see the network, the programming content, as being too liberal leaning. There have been studies that have proven that PBS content tends to be fairly fair across the spectrum, but for whatever reason, it can't seem to shake that particular reputation. Partly because PBS does try to cater to as many marginalized audiences as it possibly can. So that debate continues on to this day, and that in part has been a good bit of the discussion as to whether PBS public television and by extension public radio should continue to be funded by the government at all. So this is a good point for us to take a break. We will finish chapter 9 when we hop over to part D of this video. I'll see you over there.